Welcome, Dexter High School students in American History 9 to our Progressive Era notes that cover Chapter 4 in our textbook. And I'm providing this screencastify, so for us, this allows you a chance to get a voice that goes along with the notes. So we want to pick up with the Progressive Era and make that jump to understanding what the Progressive Era was all about. So really that's the first question, is progress and progressivism. What does that actually mean specifically? So in understanding progressivism, you have to understand that it's connected to the word progress. In short, progress means the following. It means that there are new ideas and that honest government could bring about social justice. So at this particular time in American history, we have the rise of massive big businesses. They're providing all kinds of new jobs and employment opportunities and an opportunity for people to live better lives. We also know that with all this rapid industrialization and the development of cities and rail systems and infrastructure, that sometimes taking care of people along the way is but a secondary responsibility of government and certainly these businesses at the time. So now the goal is that if we're going to make lives better for members of our society, we've got to come together and be the progress and the agents of change for that progress. And one of those main agents is going to be government, that has the responsibility at this time, or at least it's going to be asked to take on that responsibility of providing safety and security for those for whom do not have a voice. Let's take a look at some of these individuals and groups. When we talk about social justice, that's the important thing, is what is social justice? And social justice is having justice so that the following things kind of exist, and they are the following. Justice and equity. And equity is that everyone is the same under the law. So when you think of labor, liberty, you think of, the woman who holds the scales of justice, right? That she's blind. And the idea is that you have equity in terms of the distribution of wealth, that people have just as much access to make it in the world as anybody else, irrespective of their gender, their ethnicity, their faith, or other distinctions. Opportunity. The idea that in a socially just community, everybody has a chance to certain things, to own a home, a chance at a particular job, what have you. And the third one is access to privileges within a society. It does not matter what you look like. If you have a nickel to ride a electric bus in a town, or you have the right to use a bathroom facility, or to enter a park and play with your family and with your kids, you have the right to do that. You have access to all of the same things in a society, irrespective of your background. And when we think about social justice, we think of everybody's hands help build that community and have a stake in that community. So there are lots of reforms that need to take place across the United States at this particular time. Particular things that come to mind are industrialization. If you can recall our conversations about what the factories in many cases look like and the realities of those factories, jot down in your notes what you think about when you think about factories. And in urbanization, if you think about our large cities, what was life like living in those? Look back and think about what you learned about these large structures, these homes that people would rent, that Jacob Riis talked about. In fact, they weren't called apartment buildings at the time; they were called tenements, right? So, and then the third kind of reforms that needed to come were in the field of social equality for people of color, for women, trying to find that space. Can you think of specific examples of each of these that clearly existed at this particular time, that progressives were going to work hard to, using the strength of both manpower, marching and letter writing campaigns, and pressure by individuals, as well as the strength of the governments to change? So think for a minute, take a little wait time, and think about and jot down in your notes ideas of reforms, things that should change in industry, things that maybe needed to change in urban settings, and then even think of, in the third one, what are some areas that needed to take place in regard to social equity. Once you jotted those down, let's move on and think about the following. The sense of progress, or the progressive movement, really grew out of the concept of the populist movement, which was sort of spurred in the late 19th century by a demand by farmers. Then their populism, popular meaning something that finally becomes, well appreciated across many places, is that many farmers were feeling completely kind of forced to pay high prices to take their products, their final products, right, their harvests from the fields, and pay these railroad managers, these huge owners of railroads, these unpopular sky high prices to transport their goods to market. And so it was farmers that really kind of came up with the Farmers Alliance and some other groups that had these ideas that we need to fix things so everybody gets a fair shake. And just because one farmer lived closer to a rail station, could get a cheaper price for his harvest, then that was not a fair shake for somebody else who had to pay more to get their final product to market. So we were looking for equity and equality in the marketplace. And one of the other key things that was a resounding pressure that came during this time period is a pressure to eliminate government corruption. In many cases in the halls of government, whether they were the local governments, meaning city councils or mayors or what have you, towns were run by political groups and very small cadres of people that could get certain people elected. And once you were elected to office, you kind of did the bidding of whoever the political bosses were at the time. And we'll talk about political machines a little bit later in our study. Third thing, government needed to be responsive to citizens. That there was certainly now a responsibility that people saw if they were paying taxes and they were committing to their communities, they wanted a government that was transparent and actually could show what they were doing for people. And once people started to vote and said, how does my vote count? They wanted to see their vote working. And the other key thing is that obviously as we're having what we called a development of the middle class, as more and more consumers could purchase stuff, they started to kind of rise and say, hey, we'd like more conversation, we'd like more representation in what happens in the political scenes in our communities, in our towns, in our villages, in our cities. And so they began to pressure the local governmental leaders to basically kind of live up to their promise. If you ran on a platform that these were things you wanted to change in your city, then you had people finally saying, hey, we listened to your platform and now we'd like you to deliver on the promises that you made on your campaign. One of the really, really important key things at this particular time was the work for women to earn the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. Take for a moment and imagine why you think this is such an important fight. And we'll talk about this when we get to World War I. President Wilson says this is the time to support women's suffrage. It's probably very important for you to understand, too, that one of the big pressures that allowed this to happen is there was such a great organization called NASA, NAWSA, as well as many other organizing groups of women and their supporters that really were able to successfully pressure President Wilson to say, listen, kind of as a quid pro quo, women as a majority will help support the United States war effort in World War I in 1917 when we got involved in that war, if you will support our fight for universal suffrage. So there was sort of if you do this, we'll get behind President Wilson's support of the war. So I'm certainly hope you answered this. Why is women voting an important fight? Hopefully you understand that before women's universal suffrage, that only 50% of the population was recognized in terms of being citizens, because at the end of the day, if you cannot vote, you aren't a citizen. And if you're unable to vote, it means really the only way you have to vote if you're a woman is if your father casts a vote for the family, or your brother casts a vote for your family, or if you're married, your husband does. So this was a huge shift away that finally legitimized and gave credence to the fact that a woman was her own person, and that by virtue of voting, she had a voice that was as equally important as her husband's or her brother's or her father's. And if she had none of those, of course, that means she had no voice at all. But now with the vote, she had a voice. Voice, vote, vote, voice. Next thing to understand is that at the time, government was also pressured, even in the highest offices of the land, by big businesses and monopolies and cartels. So in this political cartoon you see to the left, you see a fat cat, as it were, this well-dressed monopoly, and he's headed up the steps to the White House to be invited in by a servant at the White House who's a person of color. And old Uncle Sam is sort of looking downtrodden, and the political cartoonist, it says, when McKinley is president, is clearly saying they're a little bit concerned about what happens if McKinley gets into office. Then big businesses will have even more sway in terms of getting things their way. And that was a concern, is that offices and positions of power were being bought by these big trusts and cartels, and effectually making democracy not a voice of the people, but a voice of those that had the most amount of money to curry favor or get support and favor from those who were in office. And how is that a problem? What's wrong with big businesses being able to control huge sectors of the future and the direction of the United States? Write that down in your notes, right? Jot that down. Why is that a problem? If you were to take a look at that today and say, what if, just a handful of business entrepreneurs and the like were invited always to give suggestions and ideas to the president? How could that be problematic? So leading the charge, as it were, in the progressive movement were people like who you see on your screen, Jacob Riis. And take a moment, once I go through this slide, and just pause the slide or pause the screencast and watch the actual YouTube video about what were the famous figures and achievements. These were writers like Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens and Jacob Riis and Upton Sinclair, among a handful. And their goal, they were called muckrakers because Teddy Roosevelt, the president, said these guys they're raking up the muck. And a muckraker was a historical job that was kind of a dirty one. It's cleaning up after horse manure. And so you used a muck rake to clean up a horse stall or a place and follow behind horses and clean them up. But the idea of the muckrakers is they were exposing the dark side of some issue that needed light. They were shedding light on or bringing to the forefront the realities of what was going on. They're kind of peeling back the facade or the hidden realities of what life is like there. Mr. Linke made that connection to like the Foxconn and said if you didn't understand the factories in China that employ workers to make electronic products, both for Apple and for Xbox and for Sony and the like, you wouldn't necessarily know what their lot in life is like. So what kind of tools did they use at their disposal? You probably can come up with a list of those already yourself. You probably are very aware of what tools they used. But if you're unfamiliar, let's think about that. For the first time, they used newsprint that was cheap. Most people could get their hands on a newspaper and get the news. If they didn't buy one themselves, one was left behind by another person that bought the news. And so newspapers were a carrier of the day. Bulletins, things stapled to telephone poles or to electric poles, that kind of stuff would work. Naturally, for someone like Jacob Riis, he published photographs, and those were a powerful medium at the time. Progressive movements will even grow stronger once we, in the 19-teens and actually 1920s, get the use of the radio. That will again be another social media tool at the time to reach out to people so that they can hear more about some of these things that they don't know are going on and become well informed. Right? When you think about some of the changes that did happen, like if you take a look at this wall, you can see all these different signs about hard hats and people being here for business or being safe and having danger signs. These are one of the very simple things, of course, is that you have to have a safe working environment. So changing the way that we did business, you take a large steel mill, for instance, and you would have lots of people that simply got hurt because there were things that were poorly identified or poorly signed, and you wanted to make sure that there were ways to keep people safe in businesses. And that was one of the major things that happened, is beginning to codify at the governmental level, giving the government the responsibility and right to set standards for things like safety. If you take it one step further, today in the United States, we have a federal government program called OSHA, OSHA, and it stands for Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And their job and responsibility is to make sure that workplaces have consistent ways to keep people safe. Say for instance, there's chemicals in a custodian's closet here at the high school. There's something that says there has to be an MSDS or a material safety data sheet put in that room that explains like, hey, this is chlorine and this is ammonia and this is bleach, and these two things can't be poured into each other or else you'll have a problem. So it's very important at something like an industrial level to understand that you have to have safety measures put in place. And now the federal government is the one that often has the responsibility to legislate and make sure that these things are done and people are kept safe. Another progressive thing at the time, which you may disagree with maybe a little bit if school is a place that is not always your most favorite place to be, is education for kids. So when you look in this snapshot of a early 20th century classroom or late 19th century classroom, you see kids sitting in, these nice straight, perfectly straight rows in a classroom. That begs the conversation of where they could be instead, which is, of course, a factory. But they're not. Now we're putting credence in a recognition that organized schooling and education is now a priority for kids. So there are many progressive era fixes. We wanted to end child labor. That was one of the key things, right? Get kids out of mines, get them out of factories, get them out of unsafe working places, and get them into classrooms. Another thing we were after was a shorter work week. Originally the Knights of Labor had some reasonable success, and they brought the idea of unionization to the forefront. But then following on their heels was a greater success of the American Federation of Labor. And then there was another group called the Congress of International Organizations. So the AFL was skilled workers and represented them, and the CIO tended to represent non-skilled workers. And then I think it was somewhere in the 20th century, then they came together. The AFL-CIO became one union together. Okay. Another one was to limit trusts and corporations. Teddy Roosevelt became a famous trust buster. He was a president that said, listen, when a company gets so large that they begin to have a monopoly on one particular business, that is not okay, because that deters competition and the availability for other entrepreneurs to get into the marketplace. So once a marketplace becomes so saturated and commanded by one particular player, we have to break them up. And we know that exists even today. In the 1970s and 80s, the Bell system, meaning the old telephone system, became so monopolized and held by only one company. They literally were told they had to break up into smaller companies. In your lifetime, a similar comparison can be when you have cable companies that are fighting over market share: Time Warner, Bright House, Spectrum, Charter Communications. And we'll see this again and again and again as only a handful of cable companies continue to kind of gobble up all these smaller ones. That conversation will happen up again. Another issue was the development of what were called community centers. There was an idea in large cities that it was really important to Americanize people. And there's lots of debate about whether or not this was always a progressively good ideal, but there were advantages to this that did exist. And so these community centers were designed in large cities, and were also found in smaller towns as well, to help immigrants that were coming to this country learn English. Once they could learn English, they could sit for a citizenship test. When they could sit for a citizenship test, then they had a voice in their community. If you can't vote, you don't have a voice. So that was very important. Again, other era fixes, obviously, as we've talked about already, is improved working conditions and building schools, which is connected, obviously, to having kids not in factories. Where are those kids going to be? Well, you don't want them on the streets. You want them in schools. So it also is going to be the first time that we're going to place, as a whole nation, a really concerted effort on education being a cornerstone of part of what our country is all about. So here's a picture talking about Teddy Roosevelt. He's got a picture of He's got a big, huge vice around this money bag, so to speak, and he's putting the screws on him, right? So that's a good old pun. Teddy Roosevelt's in the back here, and he's watching and looking on. So the idea here is that we're gonna stop these large trusts getting too big for their britches, and we're gonna bring them down to size. Okay. And again, this was a post or maybe an advertisement in a newspaper that talked about, here's the reality: we've got to stop thinking old method and start thinking new method. So in a factory, in the old method, the boys ran around and helped build worked in the glass factory. The new method is we have a machine now that can do the work. So now boys don't need to be working in a bottle machine. In the old days, the boys were picking out slate in the old method, and now we have a machine that can do that same work. So the elimination of child labor is a gain to industry. So in a strange way, we just got smarter at what we did instead of working so hard. There were lots of progressive era fixes. One of them was called the Galveston Plan. And the Galveston Plan was simply named after the city of Galveston, Texas. And the idea there was, before, all of the city power had rested in oftentimes non-elected people. And so now the city, rather than just having the mayor at the head of the city, was going to have a city of commissioners, meaning like a group. So there might be a commission, about 8 or 10 or 12 commissioners that sit on a council. And so when decisions are made, those people were elected and would represent the needs of the people that live in the city of Galveston. And the idea was ported from Galveston to many other cities to say simply, maybe we need more than just a mayor who gets to call the shots, but a city council that can rein in some of that sort of unilateral power or single power by one person. Okay. The other key thing is now having a direct primary where voters' votes actually matter. So before this happened, in the state of Michigan, if someone was running for a Congress seat, there would not be a primary where we would say, well, do we have 6 or 7 Republicans we're going to vote for in the Republican primary? And well, which one of these do we want? The Republicans would have a quiet, super secret meeting in the state of Michigan for a certain congressional seat, and the Democrats would do the same thing. And then out of those, they would say, well, it looks like we're going to run this candidate. So candidate would just get picked, and then we'd all have to vote for him. We never actually got to pick that person. So direct primaries allowed the voters to pick the person they wanted to get a chance to vote for come November in a general election. Women's suffrage, voting in the 19th Amendment, was a progressive movement. And something that we often also call part of the progressive movement was the temperance movement, and that was the declaration of the 18th Amendment, which actually got rid of liquor on the streets, and you could not own or possess or consume or transport or make alcoholic beverages. And that progressive movement largely came out of the concept that at the time, alcohol was seen as a huge scourge on society, and that because of those who chose to use alcohol and abuse it, that oftentimes that caused many more social ills of the time, broken families and a whole number of other things. So while later the temperance movement and the 18th Amendment would be repealed, it was indicative of the idea that people were willing to try to do whatever they thought would fix the social ills, and alcohol use beyond, where it was taken too far, it was seen as a social ill that needed to be fixed. So Americanization, this is a picture of a famous called the Hull House in Chicago, and its job and responsibility was to help immigrants Americanize. And the concept of Americanization it can be somewhat controversial. So here you have immigrants of all sizes, shapes, faiths, ethnicities, and people coming in, streaming into the United States, and they're desperately trying to find their space and place and get comfortable in this new place that might be very different to them. So these settlement houses, as they were called, this is the one I said is Hull House, Hull. It was built in Chicago. And the general idea of these was it was a place where you could learn the language, you could get some rudimentary education, sit for the citizenship test, help to find you get a job, help you understand those nuances of American culture and quote, fit in. But again, think about it. What are some good and bad things about Americanization? And those exist. Jot those down in your notes, because again, every time you pick up the banner of a new culture, it may mean you having to sort of struggle with what do you leave behind. And that can be problematic as well. So I want to be mindful that we look at that as if America is truly a place of many diverse backgrounds, we want to make sure we don't give up some of those things that make us uniquely who we are. As this progressive movement is going place, what's interesting is that you see this kind of car crash between two different rail cars. I want you to think about that there are things that we didn't necessarily fix. Okay, one of the things that passed during the progressive movement, this period between like 1890 and 1920, was the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson, passed in 1898, was a Supreme Court case that said that separate but equal could exist. And what this meant was it was a quiet shout out to and a failure of the United States Constitution to live up to its important factors of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that slavery was over, that all people in this country should be granted citizenship in the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment to say that they had the right to universally vote. And quietly, when the Supreme Court made their decision in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson that you could provide separate but equal, meaning as long as you had accommodations for people of color and accommodations for white folks, that was considered equal. The reality is that people of color in this country did not have the same access, and for some time would be remained outside society in many cases. And we'll look at a number of those instances from here until the conclusion of the class in the spring. So talking about that inequity between the races in this country, we're going to start real quickly with a group of men that started what was called the Niagara Movement. And interestingly enough, the reason it's called the Niagara Movement is because they didn't meet in the United States. The only place that would afford them rooms were across the river in Niagara Falls, Ontario. So in 1905 in Niagara Falls, Canada, this small group of men met to talk about how they could move forward some of these social justice barriers that lay before them. And in doing so, it began to lay the foundation for what would later become the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Okay, and that group, the NAACP, would be the first step forward towards legitimacy and recognition of people of color in this country to have legitimacy and rights that had been not given to them by virtue of what should have been the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So blacks, whites, and women began to challenge unfair laws. And, the key thing they were after often was they were asking for decent housing and access to professional careers. They wanted the same legitimacy as anyone else in this country, and they wanted, again, equality under the law. At the same time that African Americans were looking for legitimacy, we had indigenous or first peoples, right? Indigenous Americans that had been given promises and given treaties and told to trade land. And slowly but surely from 1837 with the Trail of Tears all the way until the beginning of the 20th century, there was land that had been given and then revoked and given again and so forth. So Indian land under the Dawes Act was quietly given away to other people who would farm the land even if they were not First Nations people. So they divided indigenous people's land and allowed people to actually take over reservations by just squatting on the land and planting on it. If they did that, they could be theirs. And that forced protest by the Society of American Indians in 1911. Again, asking for the legitimacy. You've given us territory, and then the treaty has been changed and the deal changed yet again. Additionally, we had certain immigrants to this bill that while we're working on all of this progress, we have other things that are going to roll back certain freedoms that people have. For instance, as you can see in this snapshot from a newspaper in 1924, it says, "Immigration bill is signed by president. Japanese ban becomes effective on July 1. So just a little bit before that, in California, non-citizens could not own land. So here's an interesting thing. What you would have is you could have Japanese people, and this will become very interesting once we get to the internment and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, and that is we will have Japanese residents, permanent residents that live here that in 1913 or 1912 owned land, but then in 1913 can't own land. So in essence, they're told you have to sell your land. And in some cases, Japanese people did sell, Japanese in this case, but Americans, but not citizens because they couldn't get citizenship, would have to figure out some way to sell their land. People who had children often sold their land to their children because if their children were born here, they were citizens. It gets very complicated. So additionally, Japanese immigrants were denied application to become citizens. So interestingly enough, you could live here, but even if you had every ability to profess your faith, your allegiance to this country, your ability to apply for citizenship was not there. It just did not exist. This will become very interesting in about 2013, 23, 33, in about just under 30 years. And we'll have this conversation again when we get to World War II. So one of the things I want you to have to have some takeaway with this is this. There are going to be tons of people working to try to improve, repair, make better the lives of thousands, if not millions of people in this country to try to put a face on the downtrodden, to give power and strength to those who have none, to shift power from those who wield it to others that need it. And those muckrakers that told those stories were able to make significant change. You also had lots of government players. There were progressive presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson that largely were able to gain responsibility and take recognition for many of the changes that happened at the governmental level. There were still many failures, but certainly this was a time for which we saw in America we were trying to find ways to stand up for people where we could with what tools we had at the time. Today, when we think about 21st century muckrakers, they exist out there. Can you think of social, political, economic, and cultural concerns that need to be brought to light today? Jot down in your notes. Think about the things that you think today when you look at the society that you're living in, that you think we need to do a better job of bringing to light. Things that we see that are either social or political or economic or cultural inequities, things that we could make better. And in doing so, think about this. There are 21st century muckrakers. There are all kinds of people, and they're already out there. And if you click on this picture to the left here, you can click and go to the Prezi and explain some of these people. When I think of Eric Schlosser from Fast Food Nation, and he was involved with the guys that made Food Inc. They told us about the food and how it's made in these huge factory farms. It tells you, so you know what that's like, okay? What I do want all of you to think about, and why studying the progressive movement is so important, is being able to make the jump of saying, I no longer have to sit and just be idle and just go, well, I guess there's nothing I can do about it. There's a whole army of tools, a whole quiver of tools you have at your grasp to change the world that you live in. So feel free to take a look at this sort of 21st century muckraker newspaper picture. There is a Prezi about some of today's progressives. But what I do want to ask you is, what tools do social activists today have? What are the things that they have at their disposal? And more importantly, not only they, meaning somebody out there, but what do you have at your disposal to change the world that you live in? What are ways that you could reach out if you saw something that just didn't look right or didn't feel right, and you had a gut check about that you wanted to improve in our town of Dexter, in our city of Dexter, or in our community, or our school district, or our state, or our nation? And then when I ask you about the tools, how can they use these tools to effectively to see change? What are the tools that we have, and how can we actually use those tools? So it's one thing to say, well, yeah, I guess I have an Instagram and I could do something, but how could you use Instagram and say, hey, I've been taking pictures of this in my neighborhood. I've noticed this thing, and I'm going to keep posting these until they fix this, because this is a problem, whoever they are, whether it's your township or your city or what have you. So those are our notes, and leaving them there, I want to thank you for taking your good notes. If you have any questions, jot them down, bring them to class, put your questions at the bottom of your notes, and I'll be glad to answer them as best I can. Thank you so much, and I will sign off here.